I mean, I never even told anyone. John failed every drug test the entire week leading up to our fight.
All right, Jesse on Fire. Welcome back to the channel. And we're going to talk about Jon Jones. We're going to talk about a few things relating to Jon Jones, okay? We're going to talk about Anthony Smith letting the world know that Jon Jones failed every single drug test leading up to their fight in March of 2019. And we're going to talk about that because of the timeline relating to when he pissed hot before. And I'm just going to throw out some things there, right? Number two, actually, before even number one, I think I should just say this. If it sounds like I'm talking shit about Jon Jones, I think most people actually are probably pretty good at like watching people on video. Like you have such like insight into people's lives now with like social media and they're talking on whatever. Like I would imagine if you watch my channel, you have a pretty good idea whether or not we get along in real life. And like if you watch me consistently, it's probably because you're like, oh yeah, me and this guy would get along really well. Jon Jones might be the number one guy in the entire UFC where I'm like, oh, I would be like really good friends with Jon Jones. Like he and I should, like if I make fun of him, it's probably because I see a lot of things in him that I know in myself where I'm like, this guy has major impulse problems. Geez, how do I identify a thing like that, you know? But he's like a guy I could just tell, like if we worked out at the same gym or like we're neighbors or whatever, like we would laugh a lot, man. Like same sense of humor. I think he's cool. So I'm not trying to like break his balls in a way that's like I'm not trying to phobia him, you know? I'm just going to discuss it because he's one of the biggest stars in the UFC, and that's a pretty interesting development that Anthony Smith says that he pissed hot for every single test leading into that fight. I realize we got this thing with the picograms, and supposedly that's like not supposed to matter, but that's kind of what I'm going to talk about here. So we're going to talk about that, all right? We're going to talk about that. Then we'll talk a little bit about, if I remember, because that's going to be the primary thing over there, but I want to talk about Francis still demanding the Jon Jones fight and whether these two things are connected, why Jon's not getting this fight. It looks like it's about money. Maybe it's about USADA. I don't think that's very likely, but I don't know. Like, I don't understand how this fight's not happening. I think that it has to do with UFC using specific metrics to estimate how big a fight is going to be. And I think that what they're doing with this fight is they're doing the same thing that they did with Nate Diaz forever, where they didn't realize how big of a draw he was. Like when Nate, after the Conor McGregor fight, the UFC thought that Nate Diaz was worth X based on whatever analytics that they normally use, which are probably pretty solid most of the time to dictate, you know, how big of an impact or how big of a needle mover a specific guy is. And I would imagine they had to have had that, you know, calibrated wrong for Nate Diaz. And then when they saw like, oh wow, we were totally off on this. Let's get this guy paid. Let's give him the BMF shot. We'll have him headline the show with Masvidal. You know, like they clearly figured it out. And I think with Jon Jones, they are using the metrics related to his last three fights because generally that's probably pretty solid, where it's like, okay, if Israel Adesanya did XYZ and in this one and this one and this one, then he's probably going to do this and this one, right? Like they know how much he pushes the needle and they think that Jon Jones is a known entity. What they're not factoring in is Jon Jones fighting at heavyweight against Francis is this whole different thing. Okay, and I just realized now I'm doing this out of order, but I'm going to start here, all right? So I just think that if the UFC saw this the way that I do, which is I think this is going to be an enormous pay-per-view, like a really big fight. I think it'll do 1 million+ pay-per-views, and I think that they're underestimating. Actually, you know what? I have no idea what Jon's asking for. I have no idea what he's asking for, so I can't even say this. All I'm saying is it seems like everyone involved should be doing whatever they have to do to get this fight done, because I think it's going to be a massive event. I think the UFC is underestimating it based on the analytics that they use normally to predict what type of impact a fighter is going to have on the needle. I think this is going to be totally different than any of Jon Jones' other fights because he's moving to heavyweight and because he's fighting against Francis, right? So I don't think honestly, if he moves up to heavyweight and he fights against Stipe, I think you're looking at like multiple hundreds of thousands less pay-per-view buys. And not because of like Francis is not moving the needle, those additional 200,000. It's that Jon Jones is fighting Francis that would move the needle that additional. I think it's a very unique matchup. That matchup itself is this enormous needle mover, whereby if Francis fights anyone else, it'll do this many. If Jon fights anyone else, it'll do this many. And I think they're valuing Jon at this number that he would do with anyone else. And I don't think they're giving him credit for how much bigger it would be if he fights against Francis. That's my opinion. I don't know if I'm doing an excellent job explaining that, but that's what I think. Anyway, so let's talk about the thing that Anthony Smith said. As a matter of fact, I'm going to show it to you right now. Watch.
Where are we at with Jon Jones today? When we spoke last, about a year ago, there was a little you were listen, but you were fair though. You're like, look, I may not like him as a person, but I can acknowledge that he's a hell of a fighter.
Yeah, I'm in the same place.
Okay.
We've had some I'd already had the break-in, right? When we talked,
Yeah.
After the Glover fight, he had a lot of really negative things to say and kind of taking some shots at me for the break-in and kind of making fun of me, which was really kind of out of left field, because I've never attacked Jon personally. Up until that very point, he had never taken a shot at me personally. He'd obviously said he's going to kick my ass, that he didn't, he's even said, like, I don't like that he said this, but he's never been able to refute anything I've said, because I always talk about Jon very factually. Here, he does this well, he does that well. He was suspended for this, but I never get into his drug test bullshit. I never even told anyone. Jon failed every drug test the entire week leading up to our fight. Every single drug test. I never brought it up one time in any interview, in any media thing, nothing. The commission called me every day to let me know that he was still failing his drug test. I never said anything. Like I let it be, because I was just focused on myself, and I've always believed that if you just focus on yourself, you're going to be that much more successful. So I was very shocked that he took a shot at me personally, which was new. That was definitely a new one for Jon. I don't think it went well for him. I never even really said anything. I think he got a lot of backlash on social media for it. And again, we all know Jon doesn't do well with negative press. So he's left me. He hasn't said anything about me, but I've also, again, I've stayed very true to myself. I've never attacked him personally. I talked about him today on my radio show right before I got on with you.
Now, candidly, I don't have any idea what Jon Jones said to Anthony Smith. I didn't really look into it because I don't care. It has nothing to do with this video, okay? What does have to do with this video is Jon Jones failing every single test in March of 2019. Now, why is that relevant? Because if a person, okay, when you go back to 2013, right, and you had the TRT exemption, or whenever that was. I'm pretty sure in 2013 you were still allowed to have the TRT. TRT is testosterone replacement, for anybody who's in the dark about that. So like basically if you went to a doctor, like anyone can, and they go get their testosterone tested, and it's like, and the range is between, I don't know, I think it's like 2,000 or 200 and 1,000 now. It's like the normal range. And if you're on the low side, you can supplement yourself up inside of the normal range. Now, being at 1,000 count is extremely high. The highest I've ever heard of a dude being who was not on gear that I know personally, I believe was around 800. And that was like, well, actually, unless I'm remembering this incorrectly, that's actually two people. And one of them was this DEA agent who I know who was like a fucking Mack truck, dude. But definitely was not lying, was definitely not on gear, and he got tested up to 800. I'm pretty sure Steve, my buddy Steve, just told me that he tested around 700 or 800 too, naturally. Now, but that's, again, the TRT exemption was so that anyone could get there. Anyone could be, so like if you go in, you test at 200, it's like, I think I'd rather be around 1,000, doc. And so the doctors could supplement you up to 1,000. And so like, you have the testosterone of a 23-year-old when you're 40. Why do you think Randy Couture was allowed or was able, to still be fighting competitively at age 48? I mean, do you see a lot of 48-year-old competitive fighters nowadays? Of course not. That's because of the TRT exemption. He was on HGH and testosterone replacement. So he has the hormones of a 25-year-old, right? And then when they got rid of that and they got USADA because they wanted to sell the company and so they wanted to clean the sport up, whatever. When you implement USADA, all of a sudden it's like, okay, so before, if people are on gear, it's kind of allowed, right? As soon as you take it away, now they're cheating if they're on, right? Like if Jon Jones was on gear prior to them, pulling in USADA, he wasn't even doing anything wrong, right? Because everyone had the ability to do that if they went and got the exemption, right? So like, I mean, obviously if you're going way above, which I think Alistair Overeem got popped for that, where they were like, okay, guy, you can't be walking around at 2,200 testosterone. I don't remember exactly but it was like, dude, it's too high. But God, Alistair was a monster, dude. A monster. His prime TRT Alistair was over in Elite XC and Strike Force. But anyways, neither here nor there. But once you outlaw it, now you're cheating, dude. Like, now you're cheating if you're on, which, look, it's professional sports. There's money involved. I'm not throwing rocks at anybody, I don't know. I'm just not weighing in on the ethics of it. I'm just saying, like, black and white, you're taking the risk. If you do it, you're taking the risk of getting caught and then getting suspended or getting your purse taken or having your legacy tarnished or whatever, losing money, all of those things, right? And the bottom line is, once USADA is implemented, whether or not Jon Jones is still on gear matters a lot, especially because he's in the conversation for the greatest fighter ever. Like, if he had never gotten popped for juice, I don't even think that conversation is even reasonable. Like, I think without any shred of doubt, Jon Jones has the resume to say that he was the greatest ever. It's actually not, there is no conversation. No juice pop, Jon Jones is the best of all time, in my opinion, right? But because he does have juice pops, whether or not he's still on gear matters a lot, okay? And so if Anthony Smith says, oh yeah, he failed every single test that week, and I know, they come out, they're like, oh yeah, it's just picograms, dude. It's just picograms. Okay, cool. So you're telling me Jon Jones? So when we're talking about the Anthony Smith fight, we're talking about a fight that happened, seriously, look at listen, the timeline. So he fights Daniel Cormier, then he's out for a year and a half because he, I believe, juice popped after that, right? Yeah, I think he juice popped after that. Then he comes back. Oh, no. I'm sorry. That's when he got in the car accident and all that stuff. Then he comes back a year and a half later. He fights Ovince St. Preux, wins, doesn't look amazing. Then when he's supposed to fight Daniel Cormier, he pisses hot for juice. Then he comes back, he pisses hot for juice again, right? Then he finally fights Daniel Cormier in July of 2017, okay? So that, the first Daniel Cormier fight was 2015, then the OSP fight was 2016, and then he finally fights Daniel Cormier in July of 2017, and then he pops for juice again, right? So then by the time he's fighting Anthony Smith, it's 2 years later. 2 years later. And Jon Jones said that for the Daniel Cormier fight that he pissed hot for, that was still just remnants from shit that he did. Actually, I don't even know if he even said that outright, but that was the conversation. It was it was just it's from when I did it before. It's okay, if that's true, then what you're saying is when you are still pissing hot for juice in March 2019, you're supposedly 3.5 or 4 years out from you using. That's absurd. It's absurd. It's absurd. How has that never happened to any other fighter? No other. Okay, so the juice that Jon did, no one else has ever done that kind of juice before, because there's lots of guys who get popped for, performance enhancers, and then they come back and they're clean and they don't continue to piss hot over and over and over and over and over. So unless Jon did some designer shit that, and I know people are saying, oh, it's Tyranobol or whatever. You don't know that for sure. It could be some new designer one that has a similar metabolite that looks like Tyranobol or whatever, that you used to be able to beat the USADA test, and all of a sudden they figured it out. And it was oh, this one that we thought was under the radar actually stays in your system for 100 years. I mean, you have no idea. But I don't know if that's very likely. I think I'm just opening the conversation that maybe he was still using, and then as soon as he figured out oh, they're gonna let me slide on these picograms, dude, I guess I'm good to go. I guess as long as I use this short acting shit and it's only barely in my system, I think maybe I'm good to go. Because the fact that I know he failed the Gustafson test too, so he's just failing every single test, and then they're just it's just the picograms, just let him roll. So I don't know, man. I don't know what to think of it. All I know is that I really want to see him fight Francis Ngannou. I don't think his body looks like he's on gear now at all, actually. I don't believe he's on gear now. If I was just going to look at his body, this is not a subject I'm very inexperienced on. I can look at a person and go, okay, so that person's probably... Although there are lots of people that I would say were on that are somehow beating USADA. These are not going to be shocking names if I throw them out there. Paulo Costa... I don't understand how he's beating USADA, or he really just has the most incredible genetics ever, which some people do. There are a handful of people that have genetics that just straight up don't even make sense. and he might be one of them. But I don't know. I mean, there are other people where you just look, you're like, if I had to bet, I'd bet for sure this guy's on gear. But maybe they're just one of those freak guys who have super high testosterone, and they, I don't know. Anyway, I'm not really coming up with anything original here other than that's very curious that John pissed hot every single one of those tests. But anyway, if you like the content, subscribe and ring the bell. Peace.